So the president has announced sweeping changes to the national executive, but some ministers have a tainted past. Will that affect their effectiveness in office? To discuss, we're joined by Angelo Fick, who is Director of Research at ASRI. Great to have you with us, as always, Angelo. Does this cabinet suggest to you a commitment, firstly, to clean governance? And does it suggest that the president can move as he wishes, can make the changes that he wants to?
Good afternoon, Francis, and to your viewers. Of course, all of this lies entirely in the detail, as always with the devil. If you define clean governance as meeting international rating agencies' approval, if you count clean governance as meeting corporate business in South Africa's approval, then of course this will work. As one of the commentators in your piece just said, this is, a continuation of the status quo. The question that many South African citizens and independent of government organizers and organizations ask is this good for the 60 million people who live here, or is it good for the 10% of people who've benefited from South Africa thus far? And that, I think, is where clean governance may work at the corporate tick box level, but for many millions of South Africans it does not work, because this is the man who was in charge of economic transformation policy, which we've seen has failed so spectacularly to prevent millions of South Africans from descending into penury and into greater debt.
There was a scandal at the company board with Godongwana. There were governance issues at the development bank. How big is the cloud over him?
Well, clouds can be forgiven as long as it's public money or it's someone else's money and big business is not dragged into it. Clouds linger if it's state money used for nefarious purposes that does not benefit private corporations. And we've seen this pattern the world over. And so the test for South Africans and for the African National Congress as the people who govern the Republic of South Africa is whether or not they can continue to play this game into the next decade, having played it fairly well over the last 2 decades. It increasingly shows fewer and fewer returns, not just in terms of voter support, but in terms of a population that is placid or accepting of these issues as the challenges in their everyday lives get bigger and bigger. The Gini coefficient is what it is. We are the most unequal society at peace in the world, and we have unemployment figures that are horrific. The profits over people model that we've seen fail in Greece, failing in Spain, failing spectacularly in the United States, cannot be applied to South Africa without consequences.
So I mean, we've heard over time claims that people have been accepting chickens for big parties, accepting security upgrades. When it comes to the health minister, who's now the former health minister, the claims and the SIU report saying that money was handed over at petrol stations. The suggestion is that there's a general lack of shame. And people have been asking if this modus operandi is so accepted, are there clean ministers to pick from? Maybe we don't know the half of it.
Well, quite, but one goes back to Njabulani Ndebele's point in the mid-2000s when he said, we tend to focus on corrupt personalities and we wish for non-corrupt personalities, but we don't ask questions about the system that makes corruptibility not only possible, but almost inevitable. And here I think we need a holistic reimagination of South Africa. And that means reimagining the systems of accountability, the systems of selection, so that we don't just keep looking for heroes like we're stuck in a Bonnie Tyler song from the 1980s, but that we actually begin to pay attention to the systems that work not just for the party, but for the country. Because so far the systems of selection that get people into government are really focused on those who are loyal to and benefit the party. They're the ones who get these positions. And the cadre deployment, which got defended by the president of the party at the Zondo Commission earlier this year, is a spectacular failure, as various commentators have pointed out as early as 2007 and 2008. I'm thinking of Mampili Rampili when she was still an analyst rather than a now ex-political party boss, when she pointed out that cadre deployment is part of the rot that causes the problem in South Africa. And so this is really a moment, again, where it's not just whether we can find clean ministers. It's almost as if the age of retirement in South Africa means nothing. In a country that has a majority population under 35, why do our administrative governors continue to be people in their 60s? I'm too old to represent this country. And these are people who were adults when I was a child. So there really has to be a real reimagination of governance and its possibilities so that the millions of ordinary young South Africans don't sit with a future that is made even more rotten by the old who will have been dead by the time 2040 rolls around.
Does that apply to the finance ministry as well? Because when Tito Mboweni came in, people were saying exactly that. He is a very old hand. We need fresh blood. But maybe because, he's made his fortunes or he has ambitions elsewhere, he didn't have that political pressure that some ministers may have had. Maybe that also made it easy for him to leave. But now Enoch Godongwana, also elderly, if we can say it like that.
But also that revolving door between business and government really ought to be, not a feature of the post-apartheid imagination and its institution. We see the really nefarious consequences of this elsewhere in the world. I hate to mention Spain again. One can think of other places like the United Kingdom at the moment and other parts across the continent, including Angola, where people who serve in government then go on to serve in business, and once they need to come back into government, they do so, and then they, legislate and go on to sit on boards. And the question that the Spanish political philosopher Pablo Iglesias asks is, when these people are in government, are they then legislating for the corporations on whose boards they went and sat after their stint in government, or were they legislating for the citizens who have to live with the consequences of those decisions? And that sense of accountability, this can easily be regulated. We need a moratorium or a time span, a gap between when people can sit in government and when they can go on to corporate boards. And also there needs to be a far more close watch on that line between corporations and government, because we cannot have a government of a developing economy like ours be so enthralled to business interests as if those business interests are the same as citizen interests, which we hear all the time. We even have a president of the country who quotes Margaret Thatcher, of all people. I mean, a woman who is singularly responsible through her administration of the pauperization of much of the north of England out of the welfare state net that kept people alive after the Second World War. And so we need to be very careful that economic history from other places and from our own history do not first get themselves repeated as tragedy and now as farce. And that's the danger we run with this endless class reunion of people who, were around in the 90s, were around in the 2000s, and are building a future for this country that they will not have to live with, but the majority of young people in this country, who are the majority of the population, will have to live with into the second half of this century.
Indeed, all right. Concerned about the lack of young blood. That was Angelo Fick, Director of Research at ASRI.